Think back to the last genuinely difficult decision you made. Not the small ones: what to eat, which route to take, what to watch before bed. A real decision. One with actual consequences. One where multiple paths were available and you had to choose without knowing exactly where each one led. How did you make that decision? Did you feel confident in your reasoning? Did you consider perspectives you were uncomfortable with? Did you question your own assumptions? Or did you, like most people in most moments, simply go with what felt right, with the conclusion your gut reached before your reasoning had a chance to weigh in? That gap, between the quality of thinking we are capable of and the quality of thinking we actually practice in real moments, is what this conversation is about. Critical thinking is one of those terms that gets used so broadly it starts to feel empty. People say it in job interviews, schools put it in their mission statements, self-help books list it as a skill you need without quite telling you what it means in practice. So let us be specific from the beginning. Critical thinking is not intelligence. It is not being contrarian, arguing with everything, or approaching the world with cynical suspicion. It is not a personality type. It is a discipline, a set of practiced habits of mind that allow you to examine information and situations more carefully, recognize the distortions in your own thinking, weigh evidence honestly, and reach conclusions that are genuinely your own rather than inherited reactions. It can be learned. It can be improved. And the difference it makes in how you navigate your life, your decisions, your relationships, your professional work, your understanding of the world, is profound. Let us start with the part most people skip. Before you can think clearly about anything outside yourself, you need to develop some honest understanding of how your own mind actually works. Not how you assume it works. Not how you would like it to work. How it actually works, including the parts that operate below conscious awareness and produce conclusions you adopt without examining. One powerful way to begin this is mindfulness, not necessarily in the formal meditative sense, though that is valuable, but in the simpler sense of deliberately paying attention to your own thinking. When you notice yourself reacting strongly to a piece of information, pause. Where is that reaction coming from? Is it evidence-based, or is it familiar? Is it your conclusion or a conclusion you absorbed from the environment you grew up in? Is it a considered position or a habitual one? Most people, if they are honest, find that a significant proportion of their confident opinions have never been rigorously examined. They exist simply because they have never been seriously challenged. Reflective journaling is another tool with genuine practical power. When you write about your experiences, your decisions, and your reactions, you externalize your thinking in a way that makes it visible and therefore examinable. You cannot easily analyze a thought that is still only inside your head. It is too fluid, too comfortable, too easy to revise unconsciously to protect your existing conclusions. On paper, it stays put. You can look at it. You can ask whether it holds up. Over time, patterns emerge, patterns in how you handle uncertainty, what kinds of evidence you accept or reject, which situations trigger defensive thinking rather than clear thinking. And there will be uncomfortable patterns. That is a guarantee. Because every human mind, without exception, contains cognitive biases, systematic tendencies to process information in distorted ways. Not because some people are weak or undisciplined, but because these patterns are built into how human cognition works. They are shortcuts the brain uses to process a complex world efficiently. In ordinary low-stakes situations, they often work well enough. In important decisions, they can lead you seriously astray, and the most dangerous thing about them is that they operate invisibly. You experience their outputs as simply what seems true, without any awareness that your perception is being shaped. Confirmation bias is the most pervasive of these. It is the tendency to seek out, interpret, and remember information in ways that confirm what you already believe. If you already believe a political party is corrupt, you notice and remember every story that supports that view and discount or forget the evidence that complicates it. If you have decided a particular health approach is effective, you readily accept anecdotes supporting it and find technical reasons to be skeptical of studies that challenge it. This is not something only other people do. It is something every mind does, including yours, including in areas where you feel most certain. The certainty is often the tell. The most strongly held beliefs are frequently the ones most worth examining, because they are the ones the brain has been working hardest to protect. The anchoring effect describes our tendency to rely disproportionately on the first piece of information we encounter when forming a judgment. If you learn that an apartment rents for a certain amount and then are shown a second apartment at a different price, your assessment of the second apartment's value will be shaped heavily by that first number, even if the first number was arbitrary. In salary negotiations, in pricing, in any situation where a number or a frame is introduced early, that initial anchor shapes everything that follows far more than most people realize. The availability heuristic causes us to estimate the likelihood of events based on how easily examples come to mind. Plane crashes are vivid, heavily covered by media, emotionally arresting, and they come to mind easily. Car accidents are common, often brief news items, quickly forgotten, and they do not. The result is that many people fear flying more than driving despite the statistical reality being the opposite. The ease of recall distorts the estimate of probability. None of this means you are irrational. It means you are human. But being human is not an excuse for not getting better. Recognizing these patterns is the first step, and recognition alone begins to loosen their grip. When you notice yourself having a strong reaction to new information, you can ask whether that reaction is proportionate to the evidence or whether a familiar bias is driving it. When you reach a confident conclusion quickly, you can pause and ask what evidence might challenge it and whether you have genuinely engaged with that evidence or simply dismissed it. Seeking out actively disconfirming information is one of the most powerful cognitive habits you can build. Not just tolerating information that contradicts you, but actually looking for it. Following thinkers whose conclusions differ from yours. Reading sources that do not confirm your existing worldview. Asking the people most likely to see your blind spots to tell you what they see. This is uncomfortable, genuinely uncomfortable, not just mildly so, and that discomfort is a signal that it is working. Growth happens at the edge of the familiar. Intellectual humility is the attitude that makes all of this possible. It is the genuine recognition that your current understanding is incomplete, that you have been wrong before in ways you did not recognize until later, and that you will be wrong again. This is not false modesty. It is accuracy. The person who is most certain they have no biases is almost always the most thoroughly captured by them. The person who holds their beliefs with appropriate tentativeness, confident enough to act, humble enough to revise, is the one whose thinking improves over time. Now let us talk about the actual structure of reasoning, because understanding how arguments work is a fundamental tool that most people were never taught explicitly. Every argument, however complex, has the same basic architecture. There are premises, the claims that serve as the starting points, the evidence or assumptions you begin with. And there is a conclusion, the claim being supported, what the argument is trying to establish. When you evaluate an argument, you are doing two distinct things, asking whether the premises are true, and asking whether the conclusion actually follows from those premises. Both matter independently. An argument can have true premises and still lead to a false conclusion if the reasoning connecting them is flawed. And an argument can be logically valid, meaning the conclusion does follow from the premises, while still being wrong if one of the premises is false. This distinction matters enormously in practice, because a lot of persuasive communication relies on presenting a logical-seeming structure while hiding a questionable assumption in one of the premises. A politician might say, any policy that reduces economic growth is bad, this regulation reduces economic growth, therefore this regulation is bad. The logical structure is valid. But the first premise, that any policy reducing economic growth is bad, contains a hidden value judgment and an empirical assumption that both deserve scrutiny. Examine the premises, not just the structure. Logical fallacies are specific patterns of flawed reasoning that are worth knowing by name because they appear everywhere, in advertising, political rhetoric, social media arguments, workplace debates, and ordinary conversation. The ad hominem attack dismisses an argument by attacking the person making it rather than engaging with what they said. What someone has done, who they are, or what motivates them is a separate question from whether their argument is sound. The false dichotomy presents only two options when other possibilities exist: you are either with us or against us, you either support this policy or you hate the people it is meant to help. The slippery slope asserts that one event will inevitably lead to a chain of increasingly bad outcomes, without evidence for those causal connections. These fallacies work because they engage emotion and social instinct rather than careful reasoning. They feel compelling in the moment. Learning to spot them does not make you immune to them, they still pull. But it gives you a pause, a recognition, a moment to ask whether the argument is actually as strong as it felt. Evidence evaluation is the practical complement to logical structure. Even if an argument's form is valid, the quality of the evidence supporting the premises determines whether you should accept the conclusion. And evidence varies enormously in quality. Anecdotes, individual stories, are vivid and emotionally compelling but often unrepresentative. The person who tells you that someone they know had a terrible experience with a medication, or a wonderful one, is giving you real information about one case. It tells you essentially nothing about what you should expect across the broader population. Personal testimonials are a form of anecdote. They feel like evidence. In terms of drawing reliable generalizations, they are very weak. Statistical data is more powerful, but requires its own scrutiny. Where did the data come from? Who collected it and for what purpose? How large was the sample? How representative was it? Were there confounding variables that the analysis did not account for? Correlation, two things varying together, is not causation. Ice cream sales and drowning incidents both increase in summer. Neither causes the other, both are correlated with warm weather. This seems obvious when stated plainly, but this confusion, mistaking correlation for causation, drives enormous amounts of bad reasoning in medicine, economics, policy, and everyday life. Source credibility matters, and evaluating it requires more than checking whether a source agrees with you. What is the expertise of the person or institution making the claim? What are their incentives? Are they selling something, trying to win an election, defending a position they publicly committed to? Have their previous claims proven reliable? Is the claim peer-reviewed or subject to expert scrutiny, or is it simply asserted with confidence? In an era where any individual can publish anything to a global audience, and where sophisticated-looking presentation does not require accuracy, evaluating sources carefully is not optional for a careful thinker. It is essential. Problem-solving is where these skills translate into action, and it has its own structure that is worth making explicit. The single most important and most frequently neglected step in solving a problem is defining it accurately. Most people jump too quickly to generating solutions for a problem they have not yet clearly understood. The result is elegant answers to the wrong question. Before you brainstorm solutions, before you consult anyone, before you do anything else, spend real time on the question, what is actually the problem here? Not the symptom. Not the first presenting issue. The underlying cause. A company experiencing high employee turnover might assume the problem is compensation. But if they define the problem that way and raise salaries without investigating further, they might discover that the real issue was management behavior, or unclear career paths, or cultural dynamics that money does not fix. Problem decomposition, breaking the larger issue into its component parts, helps you see the structure of what you are actually dealing with. Information gathering follows definition, and it requires resisting the temptation to gather only the information that supports the solution you already privately favor. Cast wide. Look for what complicates the picture, not just what confirms your initial read. Talk to people with direct experience of the problem who are not invested in any particular solution. Look for what has been tried before and why it did or did not work. Brainstorming, when done well, is genuinely powerful, but most people do it wrong. The value of brainstorming comes from separating the generative phase from the evaluative phase. In the generative phase, judgment is suspended. Everything goes on the list. The constraint that a solution must be realistic, affordable, or socially acceptable is lifted temporarily. This matters because the premature application of judgment shuts down creative thinking before it produces its most interesting output. The unusual ideas, the ones that feel slightly absurd, are sometimes the ones that contain the seeds of real innovation. Once you have a full list, then evaluation begins, rigorously, critically, with honest assessment of feasibility, risk, likely outcomes, and unintended consequences. And then reframing. Some of the most powerful solutions to stubborn problems come not from working harder within the current frame but from questioning the frame itself. If you have been trying to solve a problem for a long time without success, the question worth asking is, what am I assuming about this situation that might not be true? What would I see if I looked at this from a completely different angle? Reframing a problem does not always produce a better solution, but it consistently opens up solution spaces that pure within-frame thinking does not. Decision-making is the point at which thinking becomes action, and it deserves its own careful attention. Effective decisions require, first, that you have actually defined the decision clearly. What exactly are you choosing? What is the time horizon? What values are most important in this particular choice? Vaguely defined decisions produce confused processes. The person who knows specifically what they are deciding, why it matters, and what trade-offs are acceptable is significantly better positioned than the person approaching the same decision as a general feeling of needing to do something. Generating the full option set is the next step, and here the same principle from problem-solving applies. Do not stop at the obvious choices. The options that present themselves first are not necessarily the best ones. Explicitly generate alternatives. Ask what you would do if your first preference option were unavailable. Ask what someone you deeply respect would see as possibilities. The expansion of the option set, before evaluation begins, consistently improves outcomes. One tool for comparing complex options is a decision matrix, listing your criteria and scoring each option against each criterion. This works not because it produces a definitive mechanical answer, but because it forces you to be explicit about what you actually value in this decision and compels honest assessment across all relevant dimensions rather than dwelling on the dimension most favorable to your already preferred choice. The relationship between logic and intuition in decision-making deserves honest treatment. The culture of rational decision-making sometimes implies that gut feelings are simply mistakes, noise to be filtered out in favor of pure analysis. This is incorrect. Intuition, particularly in domains where you have extensive experience, often reflects sophisticated pattern recognition operating faster than conscious reasoning can articulate. An experienced emergency physician who senses something is wrong with a patient before any single test confirms it is not being irrational. They are processing subtle cues that their training has taught them to recognize. That intuition deserves weight. But intuition in unfamiliar domains, or intuition that conveniently aligns with what you wanted to conclude, requires much more scrutiny. The question is not intuition versus analysis but which tool is most reliable in this specific context. Use both. Hold them in productive tension. When they conflict, investigate the conflict rather than simply defaulting to one. Managing uncertainty is unavoidable. Most meaningful decisions are made under conditions of incomplete information, and waiting for perfect information means waiting indefinitely. Scenario planning is a useful tool here, imagining multiple plausible futures and asking how well your decision holds up in each one. The decision that performs adequately across a range of scenarios is generally preferable to the decision that performs brilliantly in your expected scenario but catastrophically in plausible alternatives. And building mental resilience is what allows you to sustain all of this over time, not just in moments of smooth sailing but in the inevitably difficult stretches where setbacks occur, where effort produces disappointing results, where your confidence in your own judgment is genuinely tested. Resilience is not toughness in the Stoic sense of simply not being affected by difficulty. It is the capacity to be genuinely affected, to feel disappointment, frustration, confusion, and to move through those states rather than being stopped by them. Emotional intelligence is the foundation, the ability to recognize what you are feeling, understand where those feelings are coming from, and make conscious choices about how to respond rather than simply acting out whatever the emotion is demanding in the moment. The growth mindset, the understanding that your capabilities are not fixed, that intelligence and skill are developed through effort rather than simply possessed or not, is not a motivational platitude. It is a cognitive framework that changes how you interpret difficulty. When difficulty means you have hit the edge of your current capacity, and the edge of current capacity is where growth happens, then difficulty becomes evidence that you are engaged with something worth doing rather than evidence that you should stop. Every setback contains information. The habit of asking what this experience is teaching you, genuinely, specifically, not just as a rhetorical consolation, is one of the most productive you can build. The person who approaches failure as a data source and uses it to refine their thinking and approach is advancing. The person who experiences failure as a judgment about their worth is simply suffering. Surrounding yourself with people who will tell you what they genuinely see, not what they assume you want to hear, is both a resilience resource and a critical thinking resource. Other people see things you cannot see from inside your own perspective. Their feedback, received with openness rather than defensiveness, is one of the most efficient routes to clearer thinking available to you. And engaging genuinely with diverse perspectives, not just tolerating them, but actually trying to understand them from the inside, is perhaps the highest level critical thinking skill of all. Not because all perspectives are equally valid, but because the perspective you have not seriously engaged with is the one most likely to contain the information you most need. The strongest version of an opposing argument, steelmaning rather than strawmaning, challenges you in ways that only strengthen your own thinking. If your position cannot survive engagement with the best version of the argument against it, your confidence in that position was not earned. Here is the question worth sitting with as you move forward: in which specific area of your life are you most resistant to having your thinking challenged? That resistance is a signal. The places where we are most defensive about our conclusions are often the places where our conclusions are most in need of examination. Critical thinking is not a destination you arrive at. It is a practice you sustain. The quality of your thinking determines the quality of your decisions. The quality of your decisions, accumulated over time, determines the shape of your life. That is not an abstraction. It is the actual mechanism by which people end up living the life they intended rather than the life that simply accumulated around them. The tools are here. The decision of whether to use them is yours.